Almost exactly 4 years ago to the day, the UK Chancellor at the time, Alistair Darling, told the newspaper that, and I quote, that the economic times are the worst for 60 years. Well, that man, Alistair Darling, seemed to have been remarkably prescient about the state of the economy and where it's going to be going. He joins me now. Welcome to INSEAD Knowledge. When you made those comments about effectively we're staring over the abyss and things are going to be really horrible for a long time, did you expect to get the reaction you got?
Well, no, I didn't, but it's the old thing, you know, people say that politicians don't tell the truth. I had a go at telling it, and much thanks I got. But it was obvious to me in the summer of 2008 that the economies were slowing down, not just ours, but the global economy as a whole. And the worrying thing was, it was beginning to become clear that many banks on both sides of the Atlantic and different parts of the world were getting into trouble. And when the banking system starts getting into trouble, then it's clear, you know, things were going to be far more serious than I think people had thought at the time.
But what was interesting was that there you were, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you know, in charge of the finances of Great Britain, and yet you were the only person, it seemed, in government, in the markets, who was actually sounding these warning bells. I mean, why were you the only person who saw it?
Well, I don't know, you know, and I'm not claiming I had some insight that nobody else had got. It just seemed to me, looking at the economic horizon, the dark clouds were gathering, and gathering with a vengeance. Now, of course, there were many people, particularly in the markets at that time, who had had such a great time for the preceding 10, 15 years, they didn't want to hear any news that was suggesting that it might all be coming to an end. And, you know, there's a lot of talking in their own book, I suppose. And similarly, you know, for politicians, it's much easier to be pointing to the sunny uplands rather than saying, look, we're going into a storm. I was clear that unless we levelled with people, unless we said, look, you are going to go through some very turbulent times, then, you know, that's when people become cynical. If they say, look, you said it was going to be great, and it's not great. So I was trying to set the music for that autumn, although I readily accept that the message was not entirely welcome.
Well, if you were setting the music for that autumn, maybe the chief conductor at the time, you know, your predecessor as Chancellor and then Prime Minister Gordon Brown, you know, he seemed to be very critical of you. You were almost, in a sense, slapped down for frightening the markets. Well,
we took a different view on that, and you know, he was entitled to do that. I actually had said the same thing as I said in this interview in August 2008, about a few weeks earlier, to another newspaper. Curiously, it had never been picked up. You know, it was there. It died a death, the story, but this one was, and you know, it's ironic actually. If people hadn't been so rude about me at the time, people would have forgotten I ever said it. So they rather helped me, even though at the time it wasn't obvious they were trying to do that. Yeah.
So what lesson have you learnt from that particular period in terms of, you know, what needs to be done?
I think the big lesson that I learnt from that period was in this case in relation to the banking system, when RBS came within hours of collapse. And that is, if you're going to do something to stop panic or to stop a bad situation getting worse, you've got to do far more than markets, that people and others expect, and you've got to do it sooner. And that is the lesson that I learned. We stopped the panic that was taking place in the financial markets over the banking system in October 2008 because we announced a massive bailout of the banking system. Now, if you look at what's happened in the last couple of years, particularly in relation to Europe, precisely the opposite is being done. Far from learning from 2008, in the Eurozone in particular, every time they meet, they delay taking action, and whenever they do anything, it's too little and it's far too late. And no wonder people are fast losing faith in their ability to sort out a problem that is going to have to be sorted out one day, but it runs the risk of leading to a situation where we have another crisis before somebody does something.
I mean, critics would argue that perhaps you should have made a bigger gesture, you should have done something sooner, because you saw the warning signs. It seemed to take a long time for that to happen, and maybe if you saw the warning signs before August 2008, you might have headed off the crisis more successfully if you'd acted earlier.
Well, I think there are two things here. Firstly, yes, of course, you know, if you look at what happened to the banking system, And you know, at the time it wasn't clear, but you know, it's quite clear with the benefit of hindsight that a lot of these banks were in deep, deep trouble long before this happened. But even in the autumn of 2008, in August of 2008, I thought things were getting bad. But if you told me that the world's largest bank, RBS, was about to collapse, you know, 7 or 8 weeks later, I'd have said surely not. But that's precisely what happened, because after Lehman's went down, confidence in the banking system just collapsed. But I come back to the point, you know, at the time, you know, yeah, I'm not saying things were perfect, but we did do more than people expected. We did it more quickly than people expected, and it worked. It got us the time that we needed. Now, I think exactly the same lesson needs to be learned in Europe today. You've got to sort out Greece with a settlement that's credible. The present one is simply not credible, leaving a country with more debt now at the end of the process than it had at the start. They need to clean up the banking system, which they did not do in 2008. And Spain is just the latest manifestation of what is wrong. And remember, Spain passed the Eurozone stress tests last year, which just shows, you know, how little they were worth. And then also you've got to look at this austerity pact they've signed up to. Austerity on its own will not work. There's no plan for growth in Europe. And I see the Eurozone simply bumping along with all the damage, all the job losses that that's going to entail.
So at the time, I seem to remember there was Gordon Brown had a slip of the tongue, and he said in the Commons that he's going to, you know, we've saved the world. Oh no, we've saved the banks. Do you think that there were any lessons that Europe should have learnt from the UK experience that they should have done, which would have made the situation we find ourselves in now somewhat better?
Well, if you look at the problem, the American banks, UK banks, and we've seen to some extent some exposure in continental Europe, they've all got the same problem. They are sitting on things that they thought were assets, but which are now, you know, pretty toxic. Or in the case of Spanish banks, all these mortgages have, you know, held over property that is never going to recover in the near future, you know, similar to the sort of thing that was happening in Ireland. The only way you can restore confidence in the banking system is to show to the outside world that you've cleaned it up. Now, the longer you don't do that, the longer it will be before investors have got the confidence to invest, because all the time they'll be worrying, well, is this banking system robust? Is it sound enough? Now, they simply didn't do that, and they keep putting it off. And until they do that, they're going to delay the time that the European economy is going to recover.
All right, so what should the present UK coalition government be doing? Because you know, your successor is getting a lot of stick for the austerity package, which seems to be squeezing any kind of growth that we may have had going out of the economy.
Well, look, the problem we've got in this country is that we haven't got growth, and because of that, the Chancellor is borrowing £150 billion more than he announced when he presented his first budget after the general election here. You will not get growth if you carry on pursuing a policy that is wholly dependent on squeezing the public sector, austerity, if you like, because all the evidence is the private sector, it's successful in some areas, but it's not coming in and taking the place, which is why, you know, there's a beginning, you know, as we go into the autumn of 2012, to be a growing consensus that you do actually, this is a time when you can invest in infrastructure projects, you know, whether it's transport, whether it's energy, and so on. And I think you will see more of that. I mean, the Chancellor won't say, sorry, I got it wrong. It'll be said, but, you know, he'll no doubt make some compelling reason why he's had to change his mind. But, you know, unless you get growth going, you won't get your borrowing down. You know, it's a fairly straightforward proposition.
But he would also probably argue, and he has argued, that the reason why they're in this position and they've got to actually put these stringent cuts in place is because he inherited from you a huge deficit.
But simply that argument doesn't stack up. There are very few people now who would argue that in 2008 the correct response of the government faced with a meltdown was to support the economy, and every country did it, from communist China to Americans with a Republican president, Europe. Everybody did the same thing, because that is a classic Keynesian response, if you like. And remember, our economy was growing in 2010. But, you know, since then it stopped growing, and it's been flat now for the best part of a year. So that argument doesn't stack up. And even, you know, today's government, the coalition government in the UK, can see now that its plans are wildly off course. Why? Because growth has stopped.
All right, so two questions then. For the UK, if you were in the Treasury now, what would you be doing? What policy would you be pursuing, which is going to be obviously different, because it's different times, from 2008?
Well, I think there are two things that the government needs to do. One is you need a credible plan for growth accompanied with a credible plan for deficit reduction. What I would like to see is the government investing more in infrastructure, particularly in housing, because housing is something, there's a short time between giving the go-ahead and actually having something to show for yourself. I think the government also needs to do more in relation to making sure that the money coming out through quantitative easing, the Bank of England, actually gets onto the high street and is available for investment. And you know, those things will help. Obviously, one of the other things that they need to look at is what other measures might stimulate activity in the economy. The second part of it, because I don't think it's right to blame all our misfortunes on Europe, but until the Eurozone resolves the problems it's facing, then it's going to be a dark cloud over us. Obviously, we're not in the Eurozone, we're not likely to be, but I think we could encourage our colleagues on the other side of the channel to address some of the problems they've got, because I think the two things are pretty related.
So what would you be saying if you were stalking the corridors of power as Chancellor now in Europe? What would you be saying to them that they should be doing?
I'd quite simply sort out Greece, sort out your banks, and start and rethink this austerity package. Now, you know, if you look in the Eurozone in relation to the austerity, there are a growing number of voices saying, hold on, this isn't working. And, you know, I just wonder sometimes if, in our heart of hearts, Chancellor Merkel isn't beginning to think that too. I understand the German politics, they've got an election next year and so on. But, you know, the Eurozone, you know, people shouldn't kid themselves. The idea that countries like Greece and so on could leave and everybody would live happily ever after is nonsense. The contagion risk is too great. You know, you're setting aside a political strategy that's lasted since the end of the Second World War. You know, I would encourage them to start thinking about how they could have a sensible strategy to get growth, because without growth, you will not get the tax revenues you need to pay down your borrowing and reduce your borrowing, pay down your debt. And that is the problem at the present time. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's the same arguments as we had in the 1930s, except people seem to have forgotten the lessons.
So 4 years ago, you came out with a very clear message: we're peering over the precipice, the abyss is before us. What's your message now? What's the headline of the prospects for the European economy and for the UK?
I think, you know, there's been a lot of talk about a lost decade, but that's where we're heading at the moment. Because I just see, you know, at best, bumping along the bottom. And, you know, bumping along the bottom, you know, compared with, you know, worse things may seem okay, but no, it's not, because the rest of the world is going to be, you know, moving on as well. What is lacking at the moment, though, is leadership at every level. You know, 2009, we had just a glimmer of hope in the G20 meeting when countries across the world agreed to do the same thing. That's gone at the moment. It needs to be rediscovered. You know, we'll have to see what happens in the United States in November, whether they can sort things out then. We'll have to see what happens in Europe. But, you know, I'm far more pessimistic now than I was in 2008. If you'd asked me in 2008, would the economy be growing 4 years later, I think I'd have said yes. But it's not, because the wrong calls are being made.
Alistair Darling, thank you very much for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you.